and then I will count us down and we will go in 3, 2, 1. Hey, welcome back, everybody. Jeff Rick here, come to you for another episode of Turn the Lens from the home studio. We're excited about this next episode. Funny, I think I don't do a lot of book reviews, but actually, when I look at my record, I actually do a couple book reviews now and then. And this is one that's very topical, very timely, and we're excited to get into the deets. So joining us all the way from the Phoenix area, he's Phil Simon, the author of 14 different business books, best-selling business books. But today we're talking about the newest book, and it's called The Nine Tectonic Forces Reshaping the Workforce. Phil, great to see you.
Jeff, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to our chat.
Absolutely. So first off, before we get into it, 14 books, I mean, you are prolific in this area, and it's pretty interesting. You've done like the whole gamut of different types of books, from dummies books, which I think, all dummies like me think we could all write a dummy book. And I'm happy to see that they're still popular, even speed producing. And I heard in one of your other interviews to get some of the stuff out for Zoom and kind of the post-COVID topicalness. Tell us a little bit about how you got into being a full-time author.
Well, I joke, Jeff, that if I didn't write my first book back in 2008, I would have needed to see a shrink. I spent most of the aughts and a little bit of the tens. Is that a thing? What do they call it? Whatever came after the aughts, helping companies implement different enterprise resource planning systems. And almost without exception, it was just Groundhog Day. Problem after problem, go to a different client in a different industry or a different part of the country, and you're basically swapping out one Yahoo or one set of data issues or technology issues for another. So they say what you know. My first book did nothing for about 5 months, and in July of 2009, I received a popular Slashdot review. Next thing you know, it was number 91 on Amazon. So somewhere sandwiched in between your boy Malcolm Gladwell and Stephen King and J.K. Rowling was this guy, Phil Simon. And then I just started banging out about a book a year. And I've tried to spread myself out a little bit and not just write the same book over and over again. I just get bored easily. And some have been about strategy books, like The Age of the Platform, how Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google have redefined business. But the last really 6 books have been about technology and the future of work. And the most recent one that we'll discuss today, The Nine, like most authors, I'm sure, say it's their best yet. So hopefully we can get into it. But yeah, I just don't sleep, have a lot of opinions, type very fast, and really enjoy the creative process. So that leads to a lot of books.
That's great. And also, we'll get into the 9 and we'll kind of be going up and down, because I think these are tectonic shifts that not only impact work, which was the specific objective of the book, but these are big societal things as well. They impact, a lot of the things in terms of the way we live, the way we entertain ourselves, the way we engage with friends and family and everything else. So I'm excited for it. So let me just read the 9 just to get that out of the way. So employee empowerment, physical dispersion, systemic inflation, automation, generative AI, blockchain, immersive technologies, I'm running out of fingers, unhealthy analytics, which is really interesting, especially in the context of some of your other books, and then fractions. I mean, I've got pages and pages of notes. I don't know where I want to begin. I think let's just start with employee empowerment, because I think that's a big one, especially in the not too distant past. We had kind of the Labor Day return to office 4.0, as our mutual friend Brian Elliott would call it, that didn't really work out so much. In the piece that you talk about a little bit, but I think that's kind of over to the top of the whole thing, is the systemic changes in the demographic makeup, especially in some of the more developed countries. You see it kind of an advanced version of it in Japan, or even seeing some things in China that's kind of a result of the single child policies of 20 years ago. So at the end of the day, ultimately labor decides, right? Ultimately, it's who could afford to walk away from the job more, the employee or the employer. And I think, we're really seeing this shift because nobody can fill all their positions, and there's just not enough people to get the jobs done.
100%. I think the most recent stats from the Department of Labor last month I think we're at 3.6% unemployment rate. And if you think about issues that we won't have time to address today, and certainly I couldn't put in the book, around immigration, around college debt, around the cost of raising a child in this country, around just some of the social factors to income families. the birth rate in many industrialized countries, including the US, has been dropping for a long time. You can't just snap your fingers and create people the same way you could go to Amazon Web Services or Google Cloud and create more compute power. So I do think that that's a long-term systemic thing. And it's more of a pendulum. It's not like we have arrived at a period of permanent employee empowerment any more so than inflation is permanent. But I put in my Swami hat as I was writing the book and said, what happens for the next 5 years and beyond? And I just don't see, Jeff, and I'm sure you'd agree, how after 3+ years of work stoppages, working from home, remote work, hybrid work, we all of a sudden snap our fingers and everyone's back through Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, dealing with crazy commutes. We needed employees, blue collar, white collar, to get through the pandemic. And certainly the technology was a big part of that. And if, as I'm fond of saying, if COVID had been a snow day, a couple of weeks, maybe even a couple of months, okay, fine, back to reality. But we have, and Brian has actually been on my podcast a couple of times as well, and I read his book, has mentioned this. We were largely successful. In fact, when he worked at Future Forum, which was part of Slack, which is now part of Salesforce, as you know, Stuart Butterfield was fond of saying, the co-founder, and he's no longer there, but if we could meet in person, but the technology wasn't there, we would not have done nearly as well as not being able to meet in person and having Slack, Microsoft Teams, Zoom, all of these new tools that have been evolving over the years. So yeah, we very much need employees, and we'll see how generative AI changes that, because that is certainly a countervailing force, but I don't necessarily think that it's a substitute. And many people say that in the future, let's just say you're a lawyer, you won't be replaced by machines, you will be replaced by people who use machines.
Right. Right. And it's a popular theme that we hear over and over, and I think is really valid, which, COVID, the accelerant to a bunch of things that were kind of underway that just kind of ripped the Band-Aid off and forced the change that maybe would have happened over a period of time. I think you had Kate Lister on. I had her on as well. And I'm like, you workplace professionals have been pounding the drum on this topic of flexibility and how it impacts employee basically happiness and engagement. Darren Murph is the greatest proponent of that, which results in better outputs. But, the thing was moving at a snail's pace until suddenly COVID showed that it actually can be done. And just for clarity, most, 60% of the jobs, I think, according to Eric Bloom, can't be done remotely. So we're talking about a subset here, generically, but, it showed that it can be done. And it showed that, the digital tools are pretty effective ways to get stuff done.
Oh, absolutely. And one of my favorite stats around the pandemic accelerating things is that I want to say March of 2020, 18% of all commerce in the US was electronic, Amazon, Walmart.com, whatever. A month later, it was 28%. And I think it was Vladimir Lenin who famously said, I'm probably the only person to quote a former Soviet leader on your podcast, but sometimes, I always screw this up, weeks happen in decades, sometimes decades happen in weeks. And I think that's very much a case of it. I think McKinsey or one of the management think tanks said that we saw 10 years of, and I hate the term, digital transformation effectively happen in the span of 3 or 4 months. All the things that in theory, and I think Bloom has written and spoken about this as well, that couldn't be done, all of a sudden we figured out a way.
Right.
So I just don't see how that goes away. And I saw a stat on LinkedIn a couple months ago that all things being equal, and maybe they never are, people are willing to accept something like on average 8% less for the ability to occasionally work from home. So that's a big deal. I mean, as you know, we're not just talking about being able to save a few bucks on gas or tolls. We're talking about getting back. The average pre-pandemic American commute was 37 minutes. So if you get back just twice a week, that's 168 minutes, right? That's over 2.5 hours that you could listen to music or go for walks or read, spend time with your family, do yoga, whatever you like to do. So there's been this qualitative shift, and I think that companies will find it'll be a sticky one. And if you look at getting to fractions for a moment, when people say, oh, we need everyone back in the office, well, when it's time for them to renew their corporate leases, actions express priorities, to paraphrase Gandhi. So JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon famously was banging the drum for full return to the office for years. But in Manhattan, I believe that when he renewed Chase's real estate he opted for something like 40% less, don't quote me on that, square footage. So there is a huge financial incentive for firms, not just in terms of office space, Jeff, but as you know, in terms of the talent pool. And I'd also argue that it's becoming table stakes. And you see this in the data. I took a very data-driven approach to this book, as I have with the last really bunch of books, but it was something like on LinkedIn, 50%, I'm sorry, 15% of the job openings are remote, but those openings receive 50% of the applicants. So employees are very much speaking their minds here and voting with their feet.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that takes us kind of into number two, which you talked about is physical dispersion, and we'll just kind of mix around and jump around. But the remote work and what is your line? The war over where work gets done is over. Get over it. And what's weird, right? We've seen offshoring, we've seen outsourcing. I had an older uncle that used to be a Southwest rep. He worked out of his bedroom 20 years ago, booking Southwest flights. They put an ISDN line into his house, and he never had to go to work to work the phone. So we've seen it. It's just kind of, it wasn't this acceptance. And I think what it really brings up is an interesting thing looking down the road. And again, I asked Nick straight up, because it's a hard question, how it's going to drive the change in pay for skills versus pay for geo. And he had a really great example. He's running an executive business thing at Stanford, and some employee moved from the high rent district to this low rent district, and somebody else found out about it and was pissed because they were getting paid for living in an expensive place. They didn't live in an expensive place. So, it will take time, but it's this interesting slowly evening out. There was another guy who talked about hiring a super brilliant engineer in like Belarus. The day before he hired the guy in Belarus, the market for this talent was defined by the area in which he was potentially employable, which was small. The day after he gets a job working for this guy, suddenly now the market for his services is now expanded. And so the available money and pay rates changed almost instantaneously.
It's fascinating to me, Jeff. I remember back when I was in grad school a million years ago and took a course in labor economics, and we covered compensating wage differentials, which is a fancy way of saying for the listeners that if you work in a certain area, let's say Manhattan, it's more expensive. And as a result, you may make more if you're a programmer, say, than if you live in Iowa. Another factor, and it's not just location, might be danger. So a police officer, a firefighter, or a coal miner could die on the job. That's probably not going to happen if you're a programmer. Although if you write some bad code, maybe your boss will be ticked off, and that's a different discussion. But yeah, we've seen with COVID, certain companies effectively eschewing economic orthodoxy. Zillow is a great example. They, I want to say 2 years ago, announced on their website, and they changed their corporate policies. Their chief people officer had written a LinkedIn post about it, about how they were introducing what they called location independent pay. So it doesn't matter if you live on the moon or Timbuktu or Manhattan, we value the job at X. And that is an enormous change. And in fact, in some cases, it might be worth it for an employee who has to work a couple days a week on site or a couple days a month to get on a plane, to drive 200 miles. And you're still coming out ahead because you're not paying $5,000 a month for an apartment in Manhattan. And yeah, that commute 2 hours every day sucked 5 days a week. So maybe you put up with it, but what if you only have to put up with it 1 day a week? So that is there. When I wrote this book, Jeff, I was amazed at the level of interplay between and among the different forces. I mean, there are so many ways these things can collide. I didn't want to put in a 9x9 chart because I thought that might be a little too cliche and forced. But yeah, to me, dispersion and employee empowerment are the first two because they're inextricably linked. And it was a little tough to separate the two, but you could argue that they're all fruit from the same tree.
Yeah, well, all these things are super interspersed, which makes it interesting. But I want to shift gears a little bit because I think one of the trends, and I don't know where I'd put it, probably under your unhealthy analytics, that COVID exposed is just really bad management practices. And I think one of the bigger things, and it kind of dovetails to what we were talking about, is kind of managing inputs versus managing outputs. And managing inputs is management by walking around. It's management by seeing if people are showing up. Do they have Excel on their computer when you walk by, or are they shopping on Amazon, versus measuring outputs? And I had a great interview with Martin Mikos years ago, who was at MySQL years ago. He's now at HackerOne, and he talked about, when you work at home, your only evidence of your work is what you do. It's the output. So it's, I think a lot of the pushback was because the middle managers actually weren't getting the support from the senior managers that kind of have a clear definition of what the objectives were, and then taking the time to make sure that the individual people knew how their contributions, impacted kind of the greater mission. And I think, they need the training, they need the help. Their bosses didn't have to manage this way, but I think it really exposed a lot of bad management. And to your
Oh,
bad
100%.
analytics, I think that, people were measuring the wrong thing. You were in HR, the once a year HR, sit down review. It's the stupidest thing in the history of time when we live in a world that changes so quickly.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there, but Ronnie Malik of Vox wrote a piece a couple months ago, came out after the book did, and it's titled something to the effect of managers are obsessed with productivity, but they can't define it.
Right.
I feel like that's very true because there is very much a power struggle with this. On SHRM, Society for Human Resource Management, about a year and a half into COVID, ran a survey, and it was something like 72% of managers wanted everyone back in the office. And I'd argue that a big part of that is that they can see employees work, which absolutely gets into trust in what are we doing here. One of my favorite pieces of the new book references Goodhart's law. And effectively, the minute that you say that you're measuring something, it ceases to become an effective measure. The classic example would be going back to the Soviet Union, nails. If you say, we really need people to produce a lot of nails. All right, fine. You get lots of these little tiny nails that if you hit with a hammer would just break. No, we don't do that. We need big nails. All right, fine. We'll create nails the size of a home, which of course aren't very practical, but who's going to hammer them? So to quote Mark Twain, there are lies, damn lies in statistics. And I'm not anti-data, as I make the point in the book. I've written a bunch of books about analytics and big data and data visualization, but it isn't hard to to manipulate the ratings or the gauges. So when Howard Schultz says we've got the badge data to prove who comes into the office, fine, I'm in the office. Does that mean that I'm productive? In fact, you can make the argument that people might be so ticked about having to come into the office just to be on Zoom calls because the manager doesn't trust them or to code or whatever, that they're going to be less productive and in fact, even a little angry. And in fact, just the time commuting to and from work, yes, you can take out your phone or laptop or iPad or whatever and be somewhat productive, but yeah, it's not as simple. And hybrid work, as Brian Elliott pointed out, is harder because of proximity bias. It is easy for me to see Jeff and go, oh, Jeff must be doing a great job because he's in the office 5 days a week. In reality, that's not true. You may not see Ryan, and he's only coming in once a month, but he's really hauling ass. So it's very difficult to solve this problem. But the way I look at it, and I make this point at the end of the book, these forces are here. They're not going anywhere. So you got a bunch of options, but I don't see how ignoring them or trying to make work great again and go all Elon Musk is really a viable strategy for most managers.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. Just the whole chapter on healthy analytics. I also grabbed the, How to Lie with Statistics was written by Daniel Huff in 1954. I had to look it up. It's about how you take the data, how you manipulate the data, and what is the story that you're trying to tell and the narrative that you're trying to tell. And unfortunately, a lot of people will find the data, find the statistics, present the data that's supporting their point of view.
Sure. Ronald Coase famously said, if you torture the data long enough, it will confess.
Right.
I love that quote because I can absolutely tweak it. And I'm pretty good with data visualization tools and analytics, but it's not difficult to tell the story that people aren't productive at home, if that's what your goal would be, because you would ignore all the outliers and treat your numbers. So it's when I hear the ROI statistics, I just roll my eyes because, come on, what are the odds you could say if we let people work from home and they were 27.2% more productive? I mean, come on, take that with some salt. But I'm not anti-data. I just think that it's important to look at our numbers and make sure that they make sense.
And I think we have a real problem to your Goodhart's law. I didn't know the name of the law. I kind of knew the law. I didn't know the name. And my favorite example is the NFL Combine. A little bit more recent. They spend all this time timing how fast people are on the 40, and yet that's not what you're hiring them to do. You're hiring them to play football. So, you take somebody like we've got right here in San Francisco. Brock Purdy played 4 years
Yep.
as a starter.
Mr. Irrelevant.
You got 4 years of tape, and yet you're making your judgment based on how tall he is or how big his hands are for whatever. It's almost like, to me, actually, I think there's a kind of an ugly underbelly. Is it just to drive gambling in Vegas, or what is really the objective? Is the objective to win a football game? Well, then why wouldn't you judge how well somebody plays football game in this close a representation as you can see, which is replicating the behavior that you're hoping that they're going to be good at, and you see it over and over and over again.
Yeah, it's fascinating to me, and I'm not a huge football fan, but what did the Niners give up 2 firsts and a third for Trey Lance?
So here's a good question for you. Would you consider the draft a success or a failure?
Yes.
And do you measure it in its totality, or do you measure it in the big strike and a miss, or do you measure it in the lucky grab at the back, or was it really luck? So I mean, there's all kind of ways to kind of slice and dice it.
It just goes to show how difficult it is to gauge employee performance. And it could be Jamarcus Russell, it could be in the NBA Kwame Brown. I mean, Darko Milicic, they got drafted by I think it was the Detroit Pistons, who I think was out of the league in 4 or 5 years. And then you've got players like Jokic, who won the MVP 2 of the last 3 years and won the title for the Denver Nuggets. I think he was the 45th or 47th person drafted. And if you look at the people, Draymond Green got drafted 35th, and he plays for the Golden State Warriors. And this is amazing to me. He can name the 34 people drafted ahead of him in order.
Sure.
So don't tell me that doesn't motivate him. And if we can't measure performance accurately in a draft or even in the real game in some instances, because Draymond's stats aren't great, but I think he's a first ballot Hall of Famer with 4 championship rings. What does that say for your head of product or your head of customer experience or programming? So yeah, it's tough in sports. And I'd argue that sports lends itself to quantification in a purer way, maybe, than a lot of white or blue collar jobs. But yeah, it isn't hard. I can remember in my days at Sony Electronics out of college, and there were folks who would game the system. I was a call center rep, and some people would figure out ways to transfer calls, and they were on the phone all day, but they really weren't taking that many calls. So yeah, the analytics thing underlies everything, because there are so many changes, and we want to say, look to the data as if the data is this ultimate and objective representation of reality. But as you know, that it sometimes isn't the case.
Right. Well, and also before you started writing, you were in HR. You were at a couple different, and you mentioned it, big companies in HR roles working on compensation plans and this, that, and the other. And it seems like HR is finally making a little bit of a shift and not treating people like a piece of steel or a car, or that something is easy to measure, kind of what you get and what you're going to get out. And I love this kind of concept we're seeing more and more, which is create the environment in which people can be successful. Because I think another big piece of this is, I don't think you called it out specifically, or I might have missed it, is, kind of the shortened duration of big companies' time on the Fortune 500 as just as a proxy for the rate of change. And I had a guy from Accenture one time, he's like, it used to be find something successful, then efficiency the crap out of it, so that you sold more and you made a lot of money. Now, with the dynamic world in which we live, it's more about flexibility than efficiency over some long period of time, because that particular product may or may not be in demand tomorrow, and the hottest thing since sliced bread that you're not even into, you might need to get into tomorrow. And that's a direct result of innovation, which is driven by risk taking. So it's a very different kind of setup in the way you treat people, because they're people, they're messy and sloppy and not logical and emotional. And there's a lot of stuff going on in people's lives.
Yeah, again, a lot to unpack there, but I'd argue that HR really has an opportunity to step up to the plate. And I've been hearing for the last 25, 30 years that HR needs to be a strategic partner. Well, to the extent that, getting back to our points about employee empowerment and fraction and dispersion, if people can work pretty much anywhere without uprooting their families, selling their homes, finding new schools for their children, why are we staying at a company? And a lot of times the data indicates that it's because of the relationship with the manager. But if the manager is a hard ass about having you in the office 5 days a week, it's only a matter of time before people will walk, whether the Great Recession has ended or not. But yeah, we've seen so many changes taking place that I like to think I've written a good book, but in 2 years I might look back and go, what the hell was I thinking?
Oh, no. It's a lot of moving parts. I like it. Let's talk about number 7, which you talk about immersive technologies, VR and AR, and I want to expand it a little bit beyond just those, the more kind of digital. in the concept of what digital has enabled. So there's digital platforms, which you talk about some, whether it's Slack or whatever, and kind of moving work to the digital platforms, which then opens up the ability to do it from everywhere. I mean, people forget you had to go to the office because that's where the paper was, that's where the printer was,
Sure.
that's where your phone was, that's where the fax was. And there's always the funny picture that people show of all the things on a desk that gets sucked up into the phone. I mean, that's
Right.
really true. It all got sucked up to the phone. And as soon as I think really Salesforce is the one who should deserve the credit to have an enterprise-based cloud application that's touching revenue, and to have that on a trusted third-party cloud that now you're actually going to put your revenue in that to kind of open up the, oh my goodness, I can really get access to this. But there's a whole nother future coming. You talked about, there's holograms and there's augmented reality and there's all these new ways. You could go to the extreme, whether it's the metaverse or virtual environments, but something as simple as a heads-up display, or some of these digital tools that people can use in the fields, whether they're doing technical service or technicians. There's so much
Sure.
opportunity in this whole digitization of work and many work processes.
Yeah. Again, there's a lot in that. You think about VR and AR immediately. You think about gaming, and when I was putting the finishing touches on the book, I pretty much had confirmation. I think it was Mark Berman from Bloomberg Business Week said Apple is finally launching the Vision Pro. And as a general rule, even though I think it's $3,500 and not a lot of people will be buying it, we all know it's going to get more powerful and less expensive. So I found two examples of companies that were actually using VR, AR, what I'll just call immersive technologies, Walmart and Accenture. And I like those examples, Jeff, because one is very much a blue collar organization. I would imagine that the median Walmart employee makes minimum wage or close to it, give or take. And Accenture, I would imagine very few employees make minimum wage because it's the ultimate in white collar work. And in both cases, the companies have made significant investments to bring immersive tech to the workplace, both in terms of training and on the basis of that, other things down the road. I just read recently, not to get off the subject into generative AI, but Walmart is also investing a boatload of cash to create a standalone internal AI tool, because they don't necessarily want employees putting data out into ChatGPT and then using that to train other models, proprietary information. So yeah, it is, I think, starting to cross the chasm. And that doesn't mean that everything can be done in a metaverse or some sort of VR type environment. But I do think that, and I've been hearing about this, I think the Lawnmower Man came out when I was 15 years old with Jeff Fahey. And I read the Stephen King book. The movie right now looks incredibly cheesy because the tech is so old. But I've been hearing about VR for pretty much my entire adult life. And I think that it is finally arrived in earnest, the same way that AI has been around for a long time. But basically things got real when you could go to ChatGPT as of November of last year and start creating your own Seinfeld scripts and poems and all sorts of other stuff.
I can't believe we're however long we're into this interview, and you have yet to drop a Seinfeld clip. So I'm a little disappointed in myself that I have not triggered a Seinfeld quote.
I'm
But I know
contractually
there will be a
obligated
few
to drop
coming.
one Breaking Bad and one Seinfeld reference per interview.
Exactly. So let's dig into the generative AI. I think there's a couple things that I think are maybe less talked about. One is kind of where it is today and where it's going to be tomorrow. And I think we always have to be really cognizant when we talk about technology. And the law you didn't put in the book that's my favorite is Amar's law, which I'm sure you've quoted, which is, we overestimate the impact in the short term, and we underestimate the impact in the long term. Often, I think, gets confused with Gartner's hype cycle. So even though I think there's some issues with it today and the accuracy still to have some room for improvement, et cetera, you can clearly see where it's going. And I think it's the two things that I think that are really important is, one is the way that we engage with the application. I mean, we're still using QWERTY keyboards. I mean, imagine how fast you could type if you didn't have a QWERTY keyboard. It's ridiculous that we're still using these things that are specifically designed to slow us down. To me,
Right.
the human interaction and the iterative back and forth that ChatGPT has kind of opened up as a way to think about prompts and a different way to interact with this supercomputer at the back end is really interesting. And the other thing, I forget, one of the OpenAI guys I saw in an interview talked about the horsepower increase over just the last like 4 years. And it's like 50,000x, whatever the number is. I'm making up a number. It's big. It's a big, big number. And to me, it's kind of like exponential curves in your face, like this big splash of, all these models are old models. They've had the models for a long time. They just didn't have the horsepower or the data sets to drive them to the level that they're getting the output now. And if you listen to Mira Marai, hopefully I'm not mispronouncing her name, the CTO there, she does this interview with Reed Hastings, and she's like, we just keep feeding it more stuff, and it just keeps ingesting it. So to me, it's like a real kind of in your face moment for the accelerating curves of exponential growth of computing horsepower, which is kind of under the covers, but this is kind of in your face.
Yeah, you probably saw that Reed Hastings received early access to GPT-4. And I want to say 5 or 6 months ago, maybe not quite that long, he actually wrote a book and named GPT-4 as a co-author. And now Amazon has basically limited the number of books that people using its self-publish tool can publish per day at 3. That's crazy to me. I write about as fast as anybody I know. And if I really haul ass, I can get a book done in 4 to 5 months. The idea that I can do 3 in a day is obscene to me. And we both know that if they put that as the limit, there were probably people who were doing 300 a day. Never mind whether they were accurate or good books or laid out properly. So there's a lot of noise there. But yeah, the OpenAI thing could be a very, very long book in and of itself. I think last time I checked, there were 30 or 40,000 books on generative AI on Amazon, and I'm sure most of them have dropped in the last year or so. But yeah, who knows what'll happen? And it used to be QWERTY based, but I think last week on GPT-4, didn't they announce a voice prompt so you can talk to it? And it's also, now it's also multimodal, which is a fancy way of saying it isn't just a text query. It can be a CSV file. It could be a JPEG. It could be a PDF. It could be code. What's wrong with my code? So yeah, where we're going, I don't know, but I thought it was important in that particular chapter to lay out some of the limitations, whether they're legal, based on veracity or transparency. I mean, if I hire you to do a job for me and you didn't do it right, I might say, Jeff, what happened here? Was I unclear? Did you drop the ball? Let's have a discussion. There's accountability. You can't necessarily ask ChatGPT or Google Bard or Claude's Anthropic, why did you do this? Because in some cases, they don't even know because they're dealing with an insane amount of data. And when a lot of people think data, going back to your earlier point, they think structured query language, SQL. I am absolutely not an expert on the technical underpinnings of these large language models, but they are not using relational databases. They're using vector databases, and it's just not a mature technology yet.
Which gets into the whole thing about explainable AI and and being able to unpack these algorithms. I don't know if you've seen the White House document on explainable AI. They're trying to get to the root of this. Can you unpack it to find out how it got to the answer? And as you know, that's virtually impossible, right? Because the data and the models, not only are they giant and complicated, but they're changing all the time.
Yeah, I read, I think it was Mark Bergen's book on YouTube, Like, Comment, and Subscribe. And he was explaining the rise of YouTube and how there were times in which the algorithm would spit out things around hate speech or around election deniability. And so why is it doing this? They said, we don't know. We really have to look into it. New York Times had a piece 4 or 5 years ago about how YouTube was recommending increasingly risque videos of teenage girls to people. And there was outrage, justifiably so. Said, well, who told the algorithm to do that? That was the wrong question. The better question was, why didn't someone tell it not to do that? Because YouTube's business model is basically ad-based. I do subscribe to whatever it is, YouTube Plus, so I don't have the commercials for $20 a month, but most people don't. So how do they keep you engaged? Well, they're going to serve ads. How do they serve ads? Will serve you more relevant content. Whether that content is objectionable to you isn't necessarily the primary concern. So, I mean, it's not nearly as sophisticated as some of the things that I've seen Bard and ChatGPT do, but make no mistake, an algorithm is absolutely AI because you're having a machine do something that a person would do. Go back 30 years, if you and I were sitting at a concert, and let's say we're going to see U2, what other bands do you like? Well, you're asking me for a recommendation. right? Versus having a machine, when you type in a query, say, all right, I think you'd like this, or because you like U2, you might like Coldplay or Muse or something like that. So yeah, there's a lot to unpack with this stuff. And I wanted to put generative AI in the context of these other forces, particularly with respect to blockchain, because when people can generate deepfakes like that, and they're very difficult to predict, how do we prevent chaos from ensuing?
Deepfake scared the death out of me, and the law of unintended consequences, that we learned in Social Dilemma, to
Great movie.
just kind of
Great
follow
movie.
up to what you said. It just so happens that the best way to get more clicks is to send the shit that's not necessarily good and doesn't necessarily make people feel better about themselves. And yet, if you tweak the algorithm for a different output, you could tweak it, but you might not get. You're just going to cost you some money because it's not for more clicks. But it's pretty scary stuff for sure.
Yeah, I do believe in the power of this tech, but one of my favorite quotes is from the Case Western University, Melvin Kranzberg. Technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. There are definitely going to be some winners and losers, and I try to present all of these forces, including generative AI, in a balanced way. And I'm not a Luddite, but you're out of your mind if you don't think that there is a downside to, in theory, all of them.
Right.
But I would argue that there is a place for them, but where do you draw the line? And you're going to find different adoption curves depending on the maturity of the workforce, the type of industry, legislation, different countries, cultures. So this could have been a 1,000-page book, but I try to distill it into something readable for the busy and intelligent reader who just wanted a high-level overview of these forces, because I have read books about all of these things, and you can really get into the weeds, but I think Pew said something like 43% of Americans don't read a single book in a year. So the odds that they're going to read 10 books or whatever on one force, never mind 9, are pretty remote. So hopefully this is a decent summary to let people know where we are, and more important, where we're going.
Yeah. Well, let's touch on one more kind of controversial one on that, which I think has to do a lot with, kind of chain of possession, if you will, to steal from the legal argument. And that's your number 6 on blockchain and trust and distributed ledger. And unfortunately or unfortunately, blockchain is intertwined with Bitcoin and cyber currencies. And I was talking to someone who's a huge proponent of Web 3.0 and cyber currencies. And I'm like, well, how come they're getting stolen all that for being so locked down secure? How come I keep reading about, getting stolen all the time? He's like, yes, but criminals there and shysters like there are in any business. But it is a really interesting thing to think about. And especially like you as an author or anyone who's a creator, in terms of ultimately defining, where did this come from? And, is there a chain of
Right.
possession or command? And where does it really stop or end? I mean, another great quote, since we're just ripping them all off, is, good artists copy, great artists steal, so where are the lines? And I think it's a really interesting, again, challenge. And I think it's the clouding because of the Bitcoin is not helping the cause at all.
Right. And many people mistakenly conflate Bitcoin with blockchain, and Satoshi Nakamura's 2008 white paper actually does not mention the term blockchain, but he or they or she, we don't know who Satoshi
which is
was.
Ironic that the person that wrote the paper on identity doesn't have an identity that we all know,
That's very meta. Yes, 100%.
and you opened your blockchain chapter with the story on Bitcoin, which I also thought was another kind of twist on a twist.
Yeah, it's easy to conflate the two, but we could talk for hours about digital currencies. I actually just finished ghostwriting a book on that subject, but keeping it on blockchain for a minute, solving the double spend problem is just one of its uses. So there have been digital currencies for a long time, but if I give you a physical dollar bill, I lose a bet to you. You are now in possession of that. You can't recreate it, at least legally, right? If you had a high-tech color photocopy or something, but let's leave that aside. Blockchain you can use for many different things. In the book, I give the example of a company called DocHub, and it's a competitor of DocuSign and some of these other digital signing tools. So if you and I engage in an agreement and I send you a PDF, you can go into any number of tools like PDF Pen or Adobe Reader. I'm sure you can find my signature online and create a signed document. Is it real? Is it legal? No, it is not. It's a forgery. So with DocHub, you can actually see this ledger if you use the software, and they'll say that Jeff received this email on October 13th at 10:49 a.m. He opened it up using his PC at this IP address. He viewed the document, he inserted his signature, he sent it to me, et cetera, et cetera. That is an unalterable chain. That's a lot different than mocking up a PDF or creating a deepfake. So will it solve all the problems associated with deepfakes? Absolutely not. But in a world of generative AI, in a world of dispersed workforces, it can prove provenance. You actually did write that code. And I didn't have to install employee surveillance software in order to prove that. So there are all sorts of other ones. I mean, to me, with blockchain, it is insane to me that if I go to a new dentist or doctor, that I have to fill out forms. There should be a blockchain of every doctor's appointment, dental appointment, eye appointment, anything medical that I've ever done. And I should be able to basically check boxes and say, yes, Jeff, Dr. Jeff, I will give you access to these things, but you don't need to know my annual income because how does that relate to whatever? So there are all sorts of applications for blockchain that I think people don't understand because it's been conflated with crypto.
Right. Okay, well, I'm going to jump ahead to chapter 10. I'm going to give some of the suggestions that you give of what you can do about this. Number one, ignore reality. Two, turn back the clock. That's always been a real successful strategy. I hear the Luddites are recruiting people. Get partially pregnant into one of these things, which we know that doesn't usually work out so well. Scale back or tap out. Or number six, steer into the skid. Well, clearly there's not a lot of steering into the skid in Phoenix, Arizona. So you must have grown up in some snowy climes at some point in time. But I think
I'm a Jersey boy.
Yeah, there you go. You don't really have a choice. You've got to lean in, especially if you're in a leadership position. And the other thing to me that I think is just really illustrative of the difficulty of someone who's a little bit older leaning into this digital phenomenon is online dating. And I saw this great study that came out of Stanford that prior to 1984, whenever the internet kind of happened, they listed all the ways that people meet their spouse. Online dating wasn't on the list, friends, church, work, bars, whatever. I think the original thing came out in 2019 or 2017, and it was like online dating was like 38% or whatever. I sent the guy a note, please send me the update. It's now over 50. So over 50% of married couples in the U.S.
Yeah, I heard it was higher than that, but okay, well, even if it's
whatever, it's more than 50% of something that didn't exist when I was in the market looking for my better half. So it's not hard to understand why people don't get it when it's something that literally didn't exist. So to understand the intimacy of relationships, to understand the power of digital communication and digital platform when it just didn't exist when you were going through certain parts of your career, it's not hard to see why it's so hard to grow up for some of these people.
Yeah, there are a lot of second order effects that in hindsight might be obvious, but at the time, who knows? One of my favorite examples back in, I think it was 2013 or so, the iPhone or the smartphones had been out for about 6-7 years. And I attended a conference in Vegas where I lived. And I had to write an article it was either Wired or Huffington Post. And it was a conference, and I just didn't find it all that interesting. And finally, around 1 p.m., someone said something that had this light bulb go off. And the stat was something to the effect of, in supermarkets, candy and gum sales were down something like 80%. Well, why? Well, because when you and I grew up, if you were online, you were just sitting there bored and you go, what the hell, I'll buy a pack of Wrigley's or a Kit Kat or whatever. Well, now when you're online, you don't look at the sweets. You take out your phone and you're playing Scrabble or on the gram or whatever the hell the kids are doing these days, or TikTok. So yeah, there are a lot of these second order effects. And that's why I don't think you can pretend that these forces haven't arrived in earnest. In my opinion, the only question is, what are you going to do about them? And if you are 58 years old and you've done well for yourself and you want to retire early, go for it. I'll be the first to admit that managing all these changes, even 4 or 5 of them, wouldn't be easy, never mind all 9. Trying to pretend, though, that they're just going to go away, to me, isn't a viable strategy. So yeah, I would argue that for most folks, the only option across the board is to steer into the skid and assume that these things are going to happen. How can you take advantage of them? Does that mean that you completely rewrite the rules of your business tomorrow? Probably not. But if your 5-year plan involves a lot of stasis, I don't think your company's going to be around that much longer.
Right. All right. Well, we're getting to the end of our time, and I wanted to close on a little bit of a shift, and that's you as an author. And we talked about it a little bit at the beginning, but you've been in the author business for 20 plus years. You've written over 14 books, and I'm just curious to get your take. You mentioned too earlier that people aren't reading as many books. You're writing about kind of trendy stuff and long-term stuff. They're business books, so. And there's this whole element that we've talked offline before we turned on record about, there's the writing, the words and the research and all the fun stuff about books. And then there's the business side of the business and the hustle side of the business. And now you've got to worry about, somebody who's really good at chat GPT prompts, but, putting up 4 new books a day or 3 new books a day on Amazon. So I wonder if you could just reflect on, what it's like to be an author. Because the good news is, you've got potentially access to reach out and touch anyone in the world, which maybe you couldn't. And also, I'm curious your relationship with your audience and your fans and your readers and how that's evolved over time. I just had a post I put up yesterday with John Fort from CNBC, and I think that's a really interesting thing in his world. Even though he works for this huge network broadcaster, he created his kind of side internet media so that he could go longer form into stuff he was interested in. He could have a little bit more direct relationship with his audience and not be kind of bound by the traditional limitations that the media that he grew up in, kind of bound him with.
Yeah, that sounds a little bit like Mark Stein. He used to work for the New York Times and ESPN. About 3 years ago, he started a Substack, and he covers the National Basketball Association. And some months during trade season, as a big basketball fan, I'll spend whatever it is, $8 a month to get his Substack. But he can take that with him. If he moved from Substack to a competitor, and this is very much imbued in this ethos of Web3, you own it. It's less centralized, right? It's if you were to, in some instances, there's vendor lock-in. So if you talked before about Salesforce, I guarantee you there's no magic button to hit, and all of a sudden you go from Salesforce to HubSpot or Salesforce to Oracle or a different CRM. So yeah, with respect to writing books and building an audience, it's really challenging because there's just so much content out there. I remember in 2012 when I was putting the finishing touches on my book on big data, I was just amazed. There was a stat from, I don't know if it was Bill Schmarzo or the guy who wrote the big book on big data or something, but the stat was something like the average person today, and this is 2012, 2013, is exposed to more information in a single day than someone in, I think it was the 15th century was in his or her entire lifetime. That blows my mind. So on one hand, there's this dichotomy. You can absolutely reach anyone. And I see my stats on my website, someone, 15 people from Belarus looked at me one day and checked out my stuff. It's amazing to be able to reach that, but then I'm not special. Anybody can. So if there's a strategy, I try to put out good content as quickly as possible. Quick story, back in 2010, I had an agent and I was working on that book about platforms, Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. And my agent was able to procure an offer from a small publisher in Boston. And they said, they love the idea. They want to do your book. My first question was, great, when's the pub date? They said, I don't know, probably 18 months. I said, deal breaker, can't do it. I'm not that smart. Other people are talking about Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. And as far as I know, there isn't a book out there on them. And now there are hundreds of books out there. One of my favorites is The Four by Scott Galloway, Prof G. Excellent book. So my agent wasn't thrilled with me when I said no, and we had a falling out. But I tend to have a bias towards action. If I'm not mistaken, on the front of my website, it reads, and I'm a big fan of quotes, as you already know, what I think is mine. The costs of inaction typically exceed the costs of action. So when people are looking for absolute certainty, to your point before about disruption, good luck with that. I mean, in hindsight, right, you might say, oh, the iPhone, of course. Well, Steve Ballmer, right, famously said, this thing is going to be a dud. No one is going to pay $800 for it. And I want to say that they've sold, it's over, I think, 1 billion iPhones. You can make the argument that it's the most successful product ever. It's basically selling at the volume of a Toyota with the profit margins of a Lexus. that typically is difficult to do. So I tend to have a bias for action. And again, I could fall flat on my face, and in a year, inflation could be 2% and employees are back to the office Monday through Friday, 9 to 5, and blockchain is dead. And generative AI was just this overhyped thing like 3D printers or 4K TVs. I don't think that's the case, but to quote Tin Cup, the golf movie, greatness courts failure. So if you're not willing to fail as an author, what are you doing? Is someone going to read a book that's just fine and they could find the same content either on a blog post or through ChatGPT or a Substack, something like that? Or do you really want to challenge and provoke your readers? My favorite movies, TV shows, musicians all push themselves. And nothing against an Iron Maiden or an AC/DC, but they tend to put out the same album over and over again. My favorite bands like Rush and Marillion, Steven Wilson are constantly switching things up. Radiohead, I don't like a lot of their music, but I appreciate the fact that they weren't just producing the same album over and over again. So that actually hurts me, though, I think, Jeff, from a branding point of view, because if I were David Allen getting things done and known as a productivity guru, and all my books are about productivity, people would know what to expect from Phil Simon book. Because I branched off into some different areas, that might make me a little bit harder to pin down, but I guess I'm willing. The fleas come with the dog.
Well, the fact that you led with Rush just changed my whole attitude about you. So now I got to come down. We got to hang out. We got to listen to some. We got to listen to some together. And like you, I like to challenge the algorithm. I mean, all the algorithm says stick to one topic, but life is too interesting. There's way too much interesting stuff going on, and this is a very dynamic world, and all that information is out there if you're willing to go check it out and dig in and do a little investment. How boring would that be just to have for one
good
book?
Things. I get it, right? If Jason Statham is the heavy and in every movie he just kicks everyone's ass, I get it, right? And I'm not begrudging that. But my favorite actor, Bryan Cranston, after Malcolm in the Middle, played a meth kingpin in Breaking Bad, right? I saw him on Broadway playing Lyndon B. Johnson. I mean, he's willing to zig when other people zag. So I've always had a lot of respect for creative types who do that. And look, there are also happy accidents. I mean, if I didn't write the 9 and just wrote more and more books about consulting projects, maybe we don't meet. So I guess that I try to steer into the skid myself. And it can be frustrating because you put out what you think is a very good book and you're not selling as much. And it's a first world problem. But I try to play the long game, and I really do enjoy the process, and it leads to connections. It leads to passive income, foreign translations, potentially. These are all things that aren't necessarily guaranteed. So I understand that it's not the life for everyone, but I just enjoy it too much. There's something to me magical about books. And if I think about how I probably read 300 or 400 business books, they've really informed my thinking. And I don't always disagree with the author. I always agree with the author, but I don't mind that either. I'd rather someone challenges my thinking rather than my just leafing through a book. Oh yeah, I know that. I don't mind it when someone throws me a curveball. So, yeah.
Great. Well, we'll leave it there, Phil. It's been really a treat to catch up. It's a great book. These are all super important topics, and like you said, each one could easily be, I don't know, 300 pages. I don't I don't write books. I don't know what the effort is to write a 300-page book. But these are all huge, important topics. So I think you've actually done a pretty good job for people that need to know a little bit and not necessarily, deciding which of the vectors they want to dig deeper into. But this will give you a good overview, and then you can figure out where you want to go down to the next level of granularity. So good job.
Thanks, Jeff. Thank you for having me on. I enjoyed it.
All right. That we will wrap it up. So he's Phil. I'm Jeff. You're watching Turn the Lens with Jeff Frick. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening on the podcast. See you next time. Take care.
Thank you for having me on. It'd be great to grab a beer with you. You and I could talk for hours about this stuff.
Love to connect sometime.